I was confused about which parts of a theory need to be assumed and which parts don't. So when I was looking at the morality of your theory, I picked out 5 premises or 5 ideas that I felt like it falls out of. That consciousness exists, evolution exists, consciousness is an information system. Information systems evolve by creating or by lowering their entropy, and that love is the fundamental nature of a low entropy consciousness. So my first question is why is it that those first 2 premises are assumptions, but the other 3 aren't?
I guess this is maybe more semantics than anything else. The first 2 are fundamental things that I start with because I cannot derive them. And the first being that consciousness exists. In order to derive that, you'd have to be able to derive consciousness. And I can't derive consciousness from first principles. And that is logically impossible for us to do. We are, in my model, we're individuated units of consciousness. And if you are a part of the consciousness system, then you can't, you can't have any first-person information. You can't have any awareness of how that system of which you are a part started, because you're a part of that system. So you'd have to get outside the system and see it from a view that was independent of the system. And you have to be independent of the system to see its beginnings. You have to be independent of the systems to be able to understand its origin. So we are a part of the system. So not being able to say where consciousness comes from is just the way it is because of the nature of our reality. It's not really a fault as it is a fact that one has to accept. Evolution exists. Now, it isn't quite so fundamental as that. That's really the one big assumption is that consciousness exists. So that evolution exists basically means that if you have a self-changing system, that self-changing system, in order to evolve, needs a purpose. Okay? If it's just some kind of a system with no purpose, then it's not going to evolve. It doesn't have any direction. Evolution isn't defined if you don't have an arrow that says this direction's evolving and this direction's de-evolving. You have to have some criteria which you base it upon. And that self-changing systems will naturally evolve to meet whatever criteria is their criteria for success. That's kind of an assumption. Pretty obvious one, that anything that is aware, that's self-changing, aware of itself, would want to evolve in a way that was good for itself. So that's not much of a stretch. I might not even need to call that an assumption. It's just logical. Now, the idea about that information, that consciousness is an information system, comes right out of an observation. So I don't call that an assumption. If we look at consciousness, what is it? What is it to us? What are we conscious of? What is consciousness? And if you ponder that, you'll see that the answer comes out that it's information. That's what consciousness is. That's what awareness is. Awareness of what? Well, that awareness is information of that thing we call what? It's information. So what are we personally aware of? We're aware of the sense data that we collect with our 5 senses. If we don't have sight, we don't have hearing, we don't have touch, we don't have smell, we don't have any of our senses, then what are we conscious of? Well, only one thing. Back to Descartes, we're conscious that we exist, that we can think. That's the only thing you're conscious of. So what we call our reality is basically information-based, information gathered by our senses. And any kind of an awareness has to be information-based, because you say, what's the basic thing that awareness can be aware of? Well, that has to be in the, aware of what? Well, what is information? So it just, that's almost like a tautology, a truism. Being aware is about information. So then saying that consciousness is an information system is just speaking something that's obviously true. It's just the nature of consciousness that deals with information. So I didn't really list that as an assumption. It's just by definition of what consciousness is, then consciousness is an information system.
And it doesn't sound like you probably get a lot of pushback on that, because I think that's pretty, I saw the interview with you and Dean Radin some years ago, and he totally agreed that consciousness is information.
Yeah, that's pretty easily acceptable. So once you know that consciousness is information, then the step that information evolves by lowering its entropy, an information system. Again, a self-changing information system evolves by lowering its entropy. That again is just an obvious fact. If you have a system and there is no information in it, so it's not really an information system, you have random bits. Okay, so consciousness is an information system. An information system with random bits has no information. So that's as de-evolved as you can get. Well, if you order the bits, that creates information. Now you have some order. And what that does is it lowers the entropy of the system. Random bits is the maximum entropy of that system, is no bits are ordered. So the fact that information systems, self-changing information systems, are going to evolve by lowering their entropy, by creating information, by ordering bits. And it's not just ordering them in any way. I mean, it could be kind of random ordering. Like I often say, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. What's next? Well, next is going to be up, because you notice a sequence of up, downs. So that ordering carries information, predictive information. So the idea that lowering entropy is another given. It's like, it's just logical. It doesn't have to be an assumption. Assumptions are those things that kind of go beyond your logical process. It's something you have to say, it just is. And I can't tell you why exactly, but we just start here and it is. So that's the assumption we start with. But things that are absolutely logically necessary, like evolution, a self-changing system will evolve itself in ways that are profitable to itself. And that criteria for profitability is whatever it is for that system. Like for our biological system here on this planet, the criteria for evolution was survival and procreation. You had to be good at those two things and you could survive. If you weren't good at those two things, then you eventually become extinct if you're poor enough at those two things. So those are the criteria. But for consciousness, the criteria is just to lower its entropy, create more information, create more order, more structure. Now, order and structure and significance is important too. Those depend not only on just the mechanics of ordering things, but on what the symbols mean, what the ordering relates to. If that ordering has significance and it's symbolic, perhaps, it means something. Maybe it's like numbers, maybe it means quantity, or maybe it means feel good. It's something that has significance. Then the entropy lowers even more, because not only have you ordered bits, but those bits mean something. And that meaning can interact with other bits that have meaning, which increases the possibilities of what the system can do, the amount of information that it has and the usefulness of that information. So I don't call those assumptions, I just call those logic. It's just obvious that it has to be that way. And if you look at computer science, you will find that they often talk about information systems in terms of entropy. Now, there's a Shannon entropy and a few other things that are defined in computer science. Those are a little different. Now they're talking about how much information can you create with the fewest number of bits? You know, it's that sort of thing. And if you can create more information with fewer items, then that's more efficient. Therefore, it's lower entropy. Entropy is a measure of disorder. Okay, so lower entropy means less disorder or more order. It also is a measure of an ability to do something. You know, in physics, we say it's a measure of, an order. It's a measure of the ability to do work. So if a system can do work, then it has lower entropy. A bunch of random digits, a bunch of random ones and zeros don't have an ability to do anything, you see. So in physical systems where we talk about energy rather than information systems, the idea that lower entropy means more ability to do work, like your car. If you took all the parts of your automobile and disassembled your automobile and laid all your parts out on the ground, you would have increased the entropy of that system called a car. And that system now would have very high entropy, and it really wouldn't be able to do anything other than just lay there on the ground. Whereas as you put those parts and the way those parts relate to each other, you are decreasing entropy. You're creating order. And you're not only creating order mechanically, but you're creating order in the significance and implications of what those parts can do interactively. You see? Right. So as the parts can do more and more things interactively, that lowers entropy. Okay, now that brings us then to the idea that low entropy consciousness, or as we evolve to lower entropy consciousness, we're evolving toward love. The opposite of love is fear, not hate. Hate is a subclass of fear. So we have love and fear. And consciousness is a social system. Remember, we started with the assumption that consciousness exists. And I end up with, I've skipped a bunch of steps here, but it's more direct answer to your question. Consciousness exists of a large collection of what I call individuated units of consciousness. Each one is a subset of the larger consciousness system. So we have one larger consciousness system, which is the source. And because we're consciousness, it's the source of everything. That's the larger conscious system. It found that to lower its entropy, it was effective to break itself up into pieces. So you had multiple chunks of consciousness interacting with each other. Because again, that's lower entropy. What can all of these chunks of consciousness do collectively? Well, that has a lot more possibilities than just one monolithic consciousness. So that's the lower entropy path. So it does that to create more possibilities, because each of these chunks of consciousness has free will. So you have n things all with free will, and each one can interact with the other in a myriad of ways. And how will they do that? You know, how will they change that? So that creates our social system, all these pieces of consciousness. And if we have a social system that is aware, so a system of units of consciousness, that's sort of a social system, then again, it's just logic to come to the conclusion that lowering entropy happens when those pieces cooperate. Cooperation requires trust. Cooperation requires caring. Cooperation requires a focus on the whole rather than just on the individual. Kind of a bigger picture. It's not just about the individual, but it's about the individual relative to all the others. So what can we all make together? And my little story I usually tell, or a little thing I use to help people see that, if you took a group of people, a group of these pieces of consciousness, individuated units of consciousness, and say you have 10,000 of them, and you have another equal 10,000 over here, so we'll have A and B, groups of 10,000. And this group A of 10,000, we give them a certain amount of space and a certain amount of resources. And we just let them go and see what they do with that. And we do the same with B. We give them the same number of, we just give them the same amount of resources and see what they do with that. One group, group A, is a group that's going to, that has very low entropy. And low entropy is equivalent to saying a high quality of consciousness. And you'll see that in a minute as we go through this. So the group with the low entropy, when they work, they cooperate, they care. They're going to optimize as much as possible with the resources that they have. So whether they need shelter or they need food or whatever it is they need, whatever their things are that they're trying to do, they're going to do it cooperatively. Okay. The group that's fear-based is very self-centered. And the reason they're self-centered is that if you're fearful, then you don't have trust. If you're very fearful, then it's all about you and making sure that you get what you need and that you get yours, and everybody else is not necessarily a threat or a competitor, but it's mainly about you. Okay, in that case, if you don't have trust, because each one is fear-based, is fearful, then if one of those people see an advantage, they understand a better way of doing things, or they see a better way to use the resources that they have, well, they're going to keep that to themselves so that they get to optimize their resources. That gives them power if they know things that the others don't know. And with that power, they can bargain to get things that they want. So you end up with a competitive culture that is about power. It's about force. It's about manipulation, because it's all self-centered. So we let those two cultures go and see how they go. So the one is acting out of love. That's the love group. They care about each other. They want each other to get as much as they can, so they want to optimize for the whole. The group based on fear, they are going to, if you're big and strong, you will take the things that someone weaker has. Just because you're fearful, you don't really care about other people. So if somebody has something you like, you take it if you can. But you also have to be able to keep it, because if something bigger than you comes along, they'll take everything you've got too. So what they will do is generally they find that there's power. Power's important here in the fearful side. So they will group up to groups of individuals, mutual defense pacts, they will call it. And now there's 10 of them together. Now they can take things away from groups that are smaller and from singles. Not a problem. And the bigger they can get, the better, the more powerful they'll have, the more power they will have. So in order to organize that power, usually you're going to have a hierarchical structure. You're going to have the one in charge, and then the ones that report to that one, and the ones that report to them, and you're going to have some kind of hierarchical process. So you'll end up with a few top dogs and a lot of underdogs in that process. They're not going to be particularly nice to each other, and there's constantly infighting going on. And these groups will grow up very much, the mindset I get, or what comes into my mind, is like the warlord mentality. Other individual units of consciousness, they will form their own groups to protect themselves from this group. And then the groups will steal each other's stuff if they can. The groups will protect their own members against the other groups. And we end up eventually, if you let that go long, you'll have 90% of the resources being controlled by 3 or 4% of the individuated units of consciousness. Those are the ones on top of the pile. And that each pile gets progressively nastier and harder to deal with the further down the hierarchy goes. Well, that sounds kind of like where we live. That's the way our culture is like that. It's a warlord mentality. And it's only been the last, 500 years or so that we've really gotten away from that warlord mentality. We have some other things now going on. We have, democracies and social systems. We have other ways of organizing ourselves other than the warlord mentality. But it's difficult for us because even if we socialize and organize ourselves in ways that are opposed to the warlord mentality, we have this drift back to that mode. That's, you have to constantly be working at holding that together. It seems like the default mode is the warlord mentality. And that if you have a democracy or socialism or something that cares about the people and not just, control, power, and force, then that doesn't seem to last a long time. Now, individual warlords don't last very long either, because there's always somebody just beneath them that would like to be the warlord themselves. So they have a lot of turnover as well. But as far as that organizational principle, that warlord mentality tends to be our default way of organizing, sort of the Lord of the Flies, idea. Your civilization comes apart, then that reasserts itself pretty quickly. So anyway, that's because we are very much fear-based. That describes us. Most people are very fear-based. We make a lot of our decisions based on fear. So the group that was low entropy, the love group, the caring, what are they going to do? Okay, so you got warlords over on the fear side. Well, in the love group, they have shared. Somebody comes up with a better way of using resources or a clever idea, they share it because they want everybody to gain. Somebody has a particular problem because they broke a leg or something happened to them, they got hurt. Well, everybody kind of picks up the slack and takes care of them until they get better, puts them back to work again. So it's a system that cares about the success of everyone and distributes those resources in such a way that optimizes the whole. That's what low entropy does. That creates the most viable, the most meaningful. We talked about information, lower entropy. What you have there is a structure that requires a lot more, a lot more thoughtfulness, a lot more structure, and it's more survivable. That group of people, if something happens, like they have bad weather or, or the town catches on fire or other things happen, they will pool resources and rebuild. Whereas over on the warlord side, it depends on who got hurt. If the little people got hurt, well, that's just tough. Nobody particularly comes to their aid. It's just, well, life is hard, deal with it. So that's the difference. So we see that the low entropy side basically is the side that cares. It's about compassion, caring. It's not about self, it's about other. And that's what defines love. Love is defined as your intentions, what you intend to do. Your intentions are about other, not about self. So that's the big thing. So if you make a choice and that choice is about you, then that's not love. If it's about other, then that might be love. could be about other because you want to know how to take advantage of that other, but you see what I mean. So that's just, again, it's another logical process. It's not really an assumption. It's just that if you have a social system that will optimize itself will not optimize, a warlord configuration is not optimal. It's really, really good for the, for the few percent, maybe in the first couple of rows down in the hierarchy, everybody else gets taken advantage of. It's not very well optimized. The other side is optimized. So that's what then lets you get to the conclusion that a low entropy system, as it evolves toward becoming love, because now we're talking about individuals, who are evolving their consciousness, their ability to make choices and interact, exchange information. So consciousness is an information system, and information systems evolve by lowering their entropy, by organizing, by making something bigger and better than what you had before, you see. And as a consciousness, you do that by caring and by being about other. So that's kind of where all those come from. So I only really had one assumption that's really an honest assumption, and that's that consciousness exists. Everything else is pretty much just logical. It can't be any other way. You can't optimize a social system of consciousnesses by control, power, and force. Those are all suboptimal tools. The only way you can optimize that is through caring. So love is the optimizing principle. Fear is the de-evolutionary principle. And it's just clearly logical, doesn't need to be called an assumption. It's not like brought in that you can't prove this, so it's an assumption. I think you can prove that beyond a shadow of a doubt because it just makes perfect sense.
Okay, good. Yeah, that clears it up for me, because I was wondering, what an assumption was, but you say that an assumption is for things that really go beyond logic, things that you can't explain logically.
Right.
And I agree that those other things, you can get there logically. Even the idea that love is low entropy and fear is high entropy, even on an individual level, when you don't look at it from the collective like you just explained. If you look at it on an individual level and what kind of effect fear has on your intellect, when I'm in a state of fear, it's very disorganizing.
Yes.
I feel non-focused, and I don't really connect well with other people. I might be snappy. But when you're in a state of love, you feel centered, you feel like you can do a lot of work, and
absolutely,
you want to reach out.
Yes. I mean, we can look at almost anything that organizes and see the same principle. You look at a pack of wolves. Well, the wolves could all just go off on their own, or they could cooperate with each other, and they're much more powerful, as a pack. But it's through that cooperation is what makes them more powerful. So just cooperating, individuals cooperating is a more powerful idea, and you can do more with that. It's more survivable, and it favors successful procreation than if everything's about, the individual. Everything's about self and self-centeredness. So it's just an obvious thing, whether you look at your own self and individual, or whether you look at animals, the way they're organized, and you look at people, the low entropy side is a side that works better. Just like in the information system, the low entropy side is where you create more meaningful, more useful information, and where you take information apart and the bits scramble and become random. That's nihilism, right? That's toward nothing. Mm-hmm. There's nothing there. So those two concepts are kind of central to the MBT idea. So I guess the other thing to say then is that we have all these individuated unit of consciousness, and if their goal is to lower their entropy, then to do that as an individual in a chat room, which is what they would be otherwise. They're just consciousness units that can share information with other consciousness units. So, that's what I call the big chat room. Well, it's really hard to lower your entropy significantly in a big chat room. There's not much traction there. There's not many choices that you make that really carry a lot of moral value or a lot of caring, or even that much self-centeredness for that matter. It's all individuals, each in their own little cocoon, transmitting and receiving messages. So if the system needed to evolve to become love, then it needed a better way to do that. And since this is an information system, the obvious way to do that was to create a virtual reality. In other words, a context within which individuals would be challenged, would have opportunities to make important, meaningful decisions with consequences, as opposed to just chatting in a big chat room. So then that takes us to, why are we here? What's our reality all about? And that's why are we here? To grow up, as you said, which is lower entropy or become love. And what is this reality? It's a virtual reality created by the information system to give us a context by which we make significant choices and get to interact with a lot of other IUOCs in ways that force us to do things that matter, interact in ways with consequences. That's what the interaction buys for us. With the chat room, doesn't really produce much of consequence.
Yeah, it probably wouldn't challenge our fear very much, because a lot of our fears it's aimed at, what's going to happen if I do this. So yeah, no, I think that answers my question very well. So I have another question here. This was also a question that I was afraid I was going to be asked during the Q&A. And neither of these questions were asked, but this still borders on the idea of what is an assumption and what isn't. And I think you answered a lot of it in what you just said, but it had to do with free will. And you say in your book that consciousness cannot exist without the ability to make self-determined choices. Consciousness and free will cannot be separated. And that's something that seems to make perfect sense to me on an intuitive level. Like, how could you have consciousness, but also not be able to make a choice? Like, the two don't seem to go together. Mm-hmm. But when I took Philosophy 101, I noticed that consciousness was brought up as a separate topic from free will. And it wasn't necessary. I wasn't taught, like, if you accept consciousness, you accept free will. Mm-hmm. And I guess I'm wondering, that idea that you have in your book, that they're tethered logically, is consciousness and free will. Is that a uniquely Tom Campbell explanation, or is that something that's widely accepted in philosophy?
I don't know about that. I can't answer that question because I don't know that much about what's accepted out there. But it is an idea that is central, at least to the way Tom Campbell defines consciousness. And that's probably the key difference. Consciousness in general out in the world is not very well understood. And MBT, more than anything, is really a model of consciousness, understanding consciousness. And I define consciousness as awareness, that has a finite decision space. In other words, it can choose. It has to have a choice. So if you have a zero, a null decision space, that means you have no choices. If there are no choices, then by my definition, there is no consciousness, because consciousness is defined as an awareness that has choices. And I call those choices decision space. You can have multiple, lots of choices. It's not a one or a zero. You can have thousands of choices. And as long as you have a non-zero decision space, then then you make these choices. So that's how we define what's conscious and what's not. So are birds conscious? Are dogs conscious? Are horses conscious? Well, do they ever make choices? Okay. And I think anybody who's owned a dog or a cat knows absolutely they make choices. Of course they make choices. Well, what about bumblebees? What about snails? What about earthworms? What about amoebas? Do they ever make choices? Well, to me, that's how you determine what's conscious and what's not. So let's look at a tree. Okay, trees obviously respond. They'll follow the sun. They're interactive in that sense. They're interactive with their environment. When it gets cold, they do different things than when it's warm. They're interactive. So that does not make them conscious. That just makes them, perhaps we could say, aware, if interactive is awareness. They're aware that it's getting cold. Now, that awareness and the things that they do can be either conscious, make choices, or hardwired, which means it's just part of their DNA. It's just part of their makeup. They're hardwired. It's a logical process, like an if-then statement in a computer program. In that case, they're not conscious. They're just doing it because it's hardwired. So if you have an earthworm, and they come out at night, the night crawlers, and if you stomp on the ground and they feel the vibration, they'll go down those holes real quickly. Okay, so that does not mean they're conscious. It just means they could be, or they may not be. If they're doing that because they're actually making a choice, then they're conscious. That would be a free will choice. I could stay up here, or I could go down. I'm going to base it on my experience and then make a decision. That's conscious. Even if the decision space is very tiny. Maybe an earthworm only gets 2 or 3 choices, things that it can do, that it makes choices. So it has a very tiny decision space, which means its consciousness is very small capacity, very small capability, very few decisions, but that would still fit in my definition of being conscious. If, on the other hand, it's just hardwired in its genetics, in its physical system, if the ground shakes, retreat, go down the hole. And it's just like when the doctor puts you one leg over the other leg and he hits your knee with a hammer, you don't think, oh, I'm going to make my leg jump. It just jumps all by itself. That's what I mean by hardwiring. It's just a response. It's a stimulus response kind of a thing. No choice made. Well, if that's why the earthworm goes down the hole, then the earthworm's not conscious. It's just responding to his biology. Okay, so in cases like that, it's hard to tell whether or not that earthworm is conscious or not, or that whatever it is. Now you can take the earthworms and maybe you can train them to go through a maze. Maybe you can teach them to go through a maze. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean they're conscious either, because they may, just by trial and error, find a way to the food or whatever else it is that encourages them to go through the maze in a particular way, to avoid shocks or get to something good. And by repeatedly do that, they may change their biology in a sense that they have memory of that pattern. And then you take those worms and put them in the maze and they just zip right through it because they've done it before. Does that mean they're making conscious choices, or does that mean their biology adjusts to their environment and kind of reprograms itself? Well, we don't know. Could be either way. So it's a little tricky for biologists to determine whether something is hardwired, like your leg popping out when your knee gets hit with that rubber hammer, or whether they're actually thought involved and there's several choices, and those are free will choices. Not easy down at that lower level, but it is easy with humans and dogs and cats and horses and lots of other critters, even bumblebees. We can see that they do have choices, and simple set of choices, small decision space, but then they are conscious. So having a clear definition of what consciousness is, the criteria that supports it, and how to define it is something that's really not out there in the general world, which is why philosophy kind of muddles around it because nobody really has a clear definition and understanding of what it is. Now, is my definition the one? I would not go that far. It's just the one that I've come to, the one that works for me, that basically draws the lines that are most useful, to me and my work. So that's probably a Tom Campbell thing, but it's not that it's a different theory than what might be out in most of the world. I think most of the world is just in a muddle, doesn't really have a theory. There are no good theories of consciousness. So it's more you have the Tom Campbell definition, or you have kind of the general muddle on what consciousness is, and it's not talked about too much, and they don't really get too specific about it because nobody knows exactly what it is and where it comes from and what it can do and what it can't do. It's kind of a mystery thing. So that's probably why you didn't get anything in your courses that do that. But the thing about consciousness is it requires thought. Thought requires free will. Okay. And making choices requires time. So it's consciousness, free will, and time all have to coexist. If you take any one away, the whole thing crumbles. None of them can exist. They can all have to be together. The reason you need time is that every choice has a before the choice and after the choice. Choices have effects. They change things. That's what the choice is. I have a decision space, and my decision space is simple. I can go to A or I can go to B. I make a choice. Well, if I choose A, then I go to A and not B. Choices change things. That's what a choice means. And when you change things, now you have to have time, a before and an after. So time is required. Without time, there is no consciousness and there is no free will. Without free will, there's no consciousness or time. And without consciousness, free will means nothing. Free will to do what? If there's no consciousness. And you see, those three have to go together as a logical set. So when I start with my assumption that consciousness exists, that also brings with it free will exists and time exists. They all come in together with consciousness. So that is there's a name for that in philosophy, when all these things are logically necessary for each other. But in any case, the opposite of that is, and completely opposed to that, is the combination of materialism and determinism. If you are a materialist, then you have to also be a determinist. Materialism sees reality as a big machine. Everything's determined. There's no other way to be a materialist without being a determinist. If you're a determinist, then you cannot have free will. There are no choices. Well, also, if you're a determinist and a materialist, you have to say there is no time, there is no consciousness, there is no free will. All of those things have to go away if you're a determinist. If you're a determinist, everything that is already there. It's already done. There is no change. See, it's a still picture, if you will. Nothing's in motion. There are no changes and no choices. It's just a complete still picture. It always has existed. It always will exist, and nothing's really changing in it. Well, that's very contradictory to our own experience. We don't experience that. We humans experience choice. We experience consciousness, and we experience time. All of those are part of our everyday experience. But those two foundations, those two philosophical foundations, are completely at odds with each other. So if you're a determinist, you have to say that consciousness, free will, and time are illusions. And if you are with my ideas, if you think that consciousness exists and then free will and time have to exist, then you would say that materialism and determinism are illusions. Each one sees the other as an illusion. They're just logically incompatible with each other. So MBT is all about the consciousness, choice, and time existing. And scientists, physicists primarily, go to a lot of lengths to get rid of time and get rid of consciousness and free will. They deny all of those as existing. And they bend over backwards and jump through some pretty strange hoops in order to make their point about that. I've never found any of that logical, which is part of the reason why I was kind of pushed to discover a bigger picture than determinism, even though I'm a physicist, because their explanations of why there is no time, no consciousness, and no free will are just full of logical holes. They don't hold up. So I was very unsatisfied with that as a fundamental worldview. It didn't wash. So that was part of what pushed me to look for other solutions.
Yeah, again, I think that makes sense. The whole idea of free will being logically tethered to consciousness, that makes sense. And whether or not that's in the philosophy literature is really irrelevant to me, because I understand it the way you say it, and I haven't heard it explained in a more obvious way. So, I mean, what should it matter whether or not it's published in the academic literature yet or not?
Yeah. Well, I should say what I mean by free will. Some people have this idea that free will means you get to have or do anything you want. That's not free will. That's having a genie in a bottle with unlimited wishes. That's not free will. Free will is the ability to make a choice from the options that you're aware of. So if you're aware that there's 5 different ways to do a thing, you get to make a choice. You have the free will to make that choice. Now, there may be 50 different ways to do that thing, but you only know 5 of them. Well, your decision space is just 5 wide. So the free will is the ability to choose among the things that you are aware of, the choices that you know that you can do. So because you're in prison and you can't go home for Christmas, doesn't mean you don't have free will. You see, and some people have the idea that free will means something else. It just means that, and if you're an earthworm and you only have a decision space with 3 elements in it, well, then it's just the ability to choose among those 3 elements. If you're a human being and it has, millions of elements in it, things that we can choose to do or not to do, and probably hundreds of millions of things in it, then we just have a larger decision space. So that's kind of my terms. And yes, of course, consciousness, what it does is interacts. And it has to do that by making choices. It has to do that. It can only make a choice if there's time. So all of those are intuitively obvious to the most casual observer, as they say in physics. So that's sort of my definitions and how I get to this point.
I agree that they're intuitively obvious too. It's those questions that I asked you today, they didn't come up until I knew I had to present this in front of a philosophy professor. Mm-hmm. I had gotten everything like intuitively, but then once I knew like I had to explain it to someone who might be critical, then my intellect started to think of like all these little areas where, someone could catch me in a logical hole. So the intellect started to get wrapped up around this stuff. But
sure.
Thank you for answering that.